let me turn things over to Mr. Yiadom, who has been discussing, the context of Ghana, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit on some of these points that were being made.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. On a day like this, when we talk about the situation of migrants, we would be very remiss if we fail to acknowledge the impact of generations of forced migration and the ongoing worldwide protests regarding racial inequality and police brutality. Our organization, our thoughts are with and prayers are with the family of George Floyd and countless others before him. And we solemnly hope for longer lasting reform on fundamental human rights and equity. That said, I'd like to segue into the points that I raised earlier. On May 12th this year, the Ghana Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration published a request for information on Ghanaians and legal permanent residents who were stranded abroad as a result of the closure of international borders, right, to contain the pandemic, to make their information available for possible repatriation back to Ghana. The conditions, though, were that they needed to pay for the cost of travel back, and also they were given 24 hours to make that information available. While this was a step in the right direction, it immediately excluded certain categories of stranded migrants. The first category being people who couldn't afford the cost of transportation back, and people who may not have even heard about this request for information, since it was the deadline was over in 24 hours. Even for those who had resources to go back home and had received this information, there was no mention of any reintegration plans. And that makes it a very difficult decision to go back on in a local economy that they had left for so long, and with the plummeting jobs in this pandemic, that actually makes that decision very difficult. On irregular migration in the wake of the pandemic, Niger is a country that has long been a transitional corridor for informal and seasonal workers from Ghana and neighboring West African countries, heading to Libya, Algeria, and onwards through the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. With this ongoing pandemic and the stringent border protection measures, we are seeing a pushback operations happening between the border of Niger and Libya, where convoys of migrants are intercepted and sent back in the middle of the desert. Later in March this year, there was a convoy of pickup cars carrying about 256 people, including 53 Ghanaians, 104 Nigerians, and 34 Burkinabes that were pushed back by Libyan militiamen close to Tumo, one of their military outposts bordering Niger and Libya. Now, these people began their perilous journey back to Niger in temperatures in excess of 120 degrees Fahrenheit for days before receiving humanitarian aid from IOM and Niger's Civil Protection Department that organized their transfer to Agadez. Each one of these people required a 14-day quarantine in efforts to contain the virus, and they had to be housed in makeshift tents in these harsh conditions. We do appreciate the effort that the IOM and certain parties, including the EU, have made to provide humanitarian aid to these people. We've also seen, this Doctors Beyond Borders, the Red Cross, all providing humanitarian aid. But as things stands now, the situation out there is really perilous, with IOM reporting assisting over 700 stranded migrants. What is missing from this picture is the impact or the action from governments of the countries of origin to actually try and facilitate the return of their nationals back to their countries of origin. IOM is carrying out some voluntary return for migrants that have completed the 14-day quarantine and want to go back home. They talk about the assisted voluntary return and reintegration program that offers counseling, transportation, and some reintegration package. But there is the need for government and civil society to step in and increase and extend these reintegration efforts for a more sustainable and longer lasting situation, that we don't have these guys going back on these perilous journeys. On the other extreme, we also, like I mentioned earlier, that we need to work with the UN and these countries to develop these humanitarian corridors where we can actually, in the ongoing border lockdowns, to arrange for aid and also to facilitate the return of these stranded migrants back to their countries of origin. Finally, I would like to touch on this situation with Ghanaian domestic workers that is currently ensuing in the Gulf states, including Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Lebanon, UAE. We have over 2,000 young Ghanaian women that are stranded in the Gulf in abusive domestic work situations. That is really akin to slavery. In June 2017, the Ghanaian government placed a temporary ban on recruitment of workers to the Gulf states, citing a hike in reported cases of abuse faced by migrant workers. Unfortunately, this did not stop such migration, and abuse of these domestic workers continue. There are some nefarious actors that lure these people on these trips for their own parochial interest. The bottom line being that these Ghanaian domestic workers are being abused. They are currently helpless with no means to return. And even in a situation like this, where there's a global pandemic, these people are most vulnerable in terms of their living conditions. And with no means to return, they feel trapped, they're helpless, and very, very vulnerable to the coronavirus. So definitely and more urgently, something needs to be done. And we propose that government and civil society take active steps to negotiate the return of these vulnerable group. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boakye.